If there is one thing that has seriously defined India as a modern-day country, it would be the colonization of the subcontinent by the British. Today, English is the common language of the nation, cricket is one of the most played sports, and the country even has a parliamentary system of government similarly to the UK. That being said, the British are also mostly responsible for the overall impoverished and divided state that India is in right now. But in this episode, I'll be discussing a scenario where India was not colonized by the British. What if a different power like France managed to take over the subcontinent and the British failed? But first, before discussing alternate history, we need real history. Before European colonization began, India was one of, if not the richest places in the world. This era of prosperity came to an end when the age of colonialism began in India in the 16th century, with Portugal creating their first trading center there. From that point, more and more European powers, taking interests in India's immense wealth and resources, began setting up more merchant and trading colonies. One of the particular powers was the British Empire. By the early 17th century, they had set up a company known as the British East India Company to serve as a trading body for the empire in India and to manage their colonial affairs there. However, roughly half a century later, Britain's age-old enemy, France, created their own East India Company for the same reasons. For a while, Britain and France and their respective companies expanded and feuded with one another. By the early to mid-1700s, however, all of this boiled over as tensions in North America led to a major war between Britain and France called the 7 Years' War. By the time this war rolled around, the French East India Company was already suffering major setbacks due to lack of government funding and poor management. This meant that in the Indian theatre of the war, the French were also slowly beaten by the British, especially in Bengal under the governor Robert Clive. After the 7 Years' War, which ended in a French defeat, France only kept a few small holdings in India, one prominent one being in Pondicherry. The French East India Company was also eventually disbanded. Besides India, their loss in the war also meant they lost all of their mainland and North American colonies to the British. The war also left Britain in a lot of debt, which led them to raise taxes on their American colonies, eventually leading to a revolution and the founding of the United States. Back in India, Britain had absorbed much more territory. After the Persian raid of Delhi in 1739, the Mughal Empire in India eventually collapsed, and most of their riches were stolen or destroyed. This brought about a period of chaos in India, which made British colonization much easier. In time, most of India was under their rule. In 1857, large parts of India rebelled. Once they were defeated, the last few princely states were annexed, and ownership of India was transferred from the East India Company to the Crown, leading to the founding of the British Raj. Under the Raj, Britain looted and stole hundreds of India's cultural possessions and traded and drained the land of its resources. The brutal rule of the Raj continued all the way to the mid-20th century, when the Raj broke away in 1947 and then broke apart into the countries of India and Pakistan based on religious lines. The state of the subcontinent since independence has been very up and down. India and Pakistan are still staunch enemies, and a couple wars have even been fought. Besides instability, the British also did well in leaving their cultural, linguistic, and political mark on the region. These imprints on India still survive to this day. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate universe, not only do the British fail to take over India, it ends up falling under the subjugation of the French instead? What if France colonized India? There are quite a few points of divergence for this to happen, however they're mostly pretty simple. For the first one, we're going to have to swap the situations of both the French and British East India Companies. The French East India Company needs to receive much more funding from King Louis XIV and the French government, while the British East India Company would have to be much more underfunded. For the second, the French would need to engage in more trade with the Indian states, forging more connections with them, and leading most Indians to view the French as more of a viable ally. For the third point, Robert Clive, the governor of the Bengal Presidency, would need to die before the beginning of the 7 Years' War. And lastly, for the fourth and final POD, the Indian theatre of the 7 Years' War would need to go slightly differently. Bengal needs to win the Battle of Plassey, and the French need to win at the Battle of Wandiwash. This doesn't mean that the French wins the entire 7 Years' War. They'd still lose in North America, but would see victory in India. These are the four PODs: On with the timeline. It's the early 18th century, and the colonial situation in India is at a crossroads. Both the British and the French, as well as other European powers, were competing over Indian alliances and territories for the purpose of trade. The French, however, had managed to gain the upper hand by now, as the British East India Company began suffering a lot of setbacks due to lack of government funding. As such, they began to lose grip on India. In 1754, Robert Clive, a major figure within the BEIC, dies of a fever. This means that the company and the Bengal presidency continues to be ruled by more and more bureaucratic and incompetent leaders. In 1756, the 7 Years' War breaks out. The British managed to secure victories in North America and Europe, taking Quebec and kicking the French out of the mainland. India isn't a happy story for the British, though. The Bengal Subah and the FEIC win at the Battle of Plassey. The French also win at the Battle of Wandy Wash in 1760. These victories are due in part to France's larger resource and supply chain thanks to their far stronger trade ties and connections to the Indian subcontinent. Britain sees the war as an embarrassing loss in India and an overall stalemate. Due to losing most of India, the British are in a lot more debt than they are in our timeline. This leads to far stricter tax laws on the American colonies and harsher treatment and control of their overseas territories. The American Revolution still happens, but the British response is much worse. This could possibly prolong the Revolutionary War. Either way, the United States still gains independence, only this time, Anglo-American relations are much more bitter, and the US forges a much better alliance with the French. By the 1780s, Canada and the Caribbean territories would be Britain's last remaining colonies. Overall, the British would be much more aggressive. From here, the British would conquer southern Africa and Indonesia from the Dutch, and even Indochina and the Philippines. The Boer Wars and the Irish revolts would all be brutally suppressed. They would also take most of Oceania, though it's possible the French would try to also take a tiny piece of Australia. Speaking of the French, just like Britain in our timeline, they'd exploit the various chaotic feuds between Indian states, and the French East India Company would slowly but surely expand across India, eventually taking over most of the subcontinent just like the British. I think the French Revolution would have still happened though. Despite winning India, the French would have still lost everywhere else. On top of that, they would have still supported America in the Revolutionary War. Their debt would have still been high. Louis XVI would have still ascended the throne and would have probably still bankrupted the French economy with his ridiculous spending. The only thing different about the French Revolution would be that due to the situation not necessarily being as bad as in our timeline, it would possibly not be as violent. The revolutionary government would also try to dissolve and absorb the French East India Company. A new and possibly more progressive French Republic is founded, and ownership of India is transferred from the FEIC to the French government. Of course, the British would use this as an attempt to retake India. Regardless, the French Revolution would have still brought about a period of secularism in France and the Empire. This applies to India, where slowly, religion on a governmental level and religious segregation would be more and more discouraged. This means that India would gain independence as a united country, and Pakistan and Bangladesh would have never existed. With the French Revolution still happening, let's also assume that Napoleon still comes in and starts the Napoleonic Wars, only this time, he puts much more effort and funding into the Egyptian campaign, and manages to add Egypt and even the Levant up to Syria to the French Empire. The French army would also be made up of lots of people from India. After taking Syria, France would have then forced a treaty with the Ottoman Empire, annexing more territory. The Ottoman Empire would then join the War of the Fifth Coalition, leading to a much larger front opening up, and leading to Napoleon being toppled in 1811. It's unlikely, though, that the French colonial empire would have seen much harm, and France would probably dominate North Africa, if not after the Napoleonic Wars, then during the scramble for Africa. In the 1850s, the French Empire would build the Suez Canal, leading to Somalia, Yemen, and Oman becoming French client states. France would also enforce Italian disunity in order to ensure that the region would stay under their influence. Besides France, thanks to India not being under the British, the Opium Wars would never happen, and China would be much more stable going into the late 19th century, maybe preventing the Boxer Rebellion. By the 1860s, the British would experience a cotton famine, which would have been made much worse by the fact that they don't have access to the Indian textile industries. Luckily, a civil war would begin in the US, giving the UK a chance to support the CSA in hopes of more cotton. There is a chance that France would then support the US, eventually leading to a domino effect which would plunge the world into a great war. However, that's extremely unlikely. Actually, there are quite a few chances for the First World War to happen prematurely in this timeline. Another good one would be the Franco-Prussian War. Assuming the British are still staunch enemies of the French by the 1870s, there's also the possibility of them backing the Prussians militarily. I don't want to complicate things though, so I'll just make the First World War happen at the same or similar time that it did in our timeline. As for the Franco-Prussian War itself, the German states would still win and unite at the time that they did. The sides of this alternate First World War would be very strange though. At this point, there is a very decent chance that the UK would side with Germany and the Central Powers against the French. The US, being a French ally, then joins the Entente earlier. With both sides of the war askew, and with France having extra imperial support, it would honestly be interesting to see how this war would play out and who would win. However, just to be cruel, I'm going to leave that up to the viewer. Let's talk a bit now about India, as they're kind of the subject of this video. Under French colonization, the state of their country would be alien to us. First of all, if India was to gain independence from the French, they'd either gain independence as one whole nation or a bunch of different divided nations. The method by which they gain independence might also be different, with the Indian people possibly becoming militant in order to kick out their alternate colonizers. Even as an independent country, the cultural implications of this timeline would be extreme. Languages like Hindi, Urdu, Tamil, Punjabi, and Malayalam, and so on, would probably still be spoken widely, however the country's common language would be French. In government, India would have a single president and a congress instead of a prime minister and a parliament. Football, normal football, would be the national sport of India instead of hockey and cricket. The French national team would also have a decent amount of Indian players. The stereotype that the British drink tea would be non-existent and instead would be applied to the French. Unlike how the British got interested in Indian culture after colonization, the French would have immersed themselves in it from day one. One bad thing, though, is that colonization of India would have still been horrible. When France colonized places like Algeria and Indochina, they committed some terrible atrocities. If France got India, they would have still starved them of their resources, and it's likely that most of the Indian famines that happened in our world would have still happened. By the modern day, India, even though it would be united, would have still been a country struggling with poverty, recovering from French colonialism, and dealing with overpopulation. Once again, if you guys have any ideas for how World War I could play out in this timeline, please feel free to say so in the comments. Anyways, thank you all for watching, be sure to subscribe, and suggest some alternate history scenarios I can do in the future. See ya!